She didn't cry. That was the first thing that shocked everyone who later heard the story. On the night her husband of 23 years had her escorted off the property, their property, built on her blood and silence. Eleanor Brooks stood in the cold rain on that long driveway, clutching a single weathered suitcase, and she did not shed one tear. The iron gates of the mansion she had helped design, furnish, and fill with life slowly groaned shut in front of her face. And from the other side, her husband Richard's voice floated out like something casual, something rehearsed. "I don't need dead weight in my life anymore." And then silence, just the sound of rain, and the gates clicking into place. Now cut forward exactly 5 days. A private jet touches down at JFK. A conference hall in Manhattan is buzzing. Business executives in sharp suits are crowding around screens and phones, papers flying. And on every single screen, on every single headline, on every single page of Forbes Global Billionaires Special Edition, there is one name, one face, one story that nobody, including Richard Brooks, ever saw coming. His champagne glass slipped, literally slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Because the woman on every screen, the woman every anchor was talking about, the woman suddenly being called the most extraordinary financial mind of her generation. It was Eleanor, his Eleanor, the woman he called dead weight, the woman he threw out into the rain with nothing but a suitcase. And now here is the question that stopped the entire business world cold. How does a woman go from standing barefoot on a wet driveway to dominating every Forbes headline in less than a week? And more importantly, why did her own husband never know who she truly was? Stay with this story until the very end. Because this is not just about money or revenge. This is about a 23-year secret, a sacrifice so quiet it was invisible, and a truth that was always hiding in plain sight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how all of this unraveled, you have to understand what questions were suddenly racing through everyone's minds the moment Eleanor's name hit those headlines. Why did Richard suddenly discard his wife after 23 years of marriage? How had she accumulated a fortune that dwarfed his own without him ever knowing? Was she hiding her identity the entire time? Who really built the empire behind Brooks Technologies? And why would one woman's single signature be enough to collapse a $50 million deal that Richard had spent years chasing? These weren't just interesting questions. They were the questions that unraveled everything Richard thought he knew about his own life. And the answers took everyone. Journalists, executives, even people who knew the Brooks family personally, completely by surprise. To understand any of it, you have to go back, way back. 23 years. To a tiny, cluttered garage in New Jersey, where two young people sat across a folding table with a business plan between them and nothing but hope to eat. Eleanor Whitfield was 25 years old when she met Richard Brooks. She was sharp, quietly brilliant, and already making waves as a junior financial analyst on Wall Street. She had the kind of mind that could read a balance sheet the way most people read a map. Instinctively, precisely, with a sense of where everything was headed. Her colleagues respected her. Her supervisors were watching her. She had a trajectory. Richard was 29. He had big ideas, electric energy, and absolutely no money. He was renting a room above a hardware store and surviving on instant noodles and borrowed confidence. He had a concept for a technology company, but no funding, no infrastructure, and no real plan. What he did have was charm. And when he met Eleanor at a mutual friend's dinner party, he turned all of it on her. She wasn't swept away easily. Eleanor was careful with people, cautious in the way that genuinely intelligent people tend to be. But there was something in Richard's passion, his raw hunger to build something real, that reached her. And when he spread his notes across her kitchen table one evening and started talking about his vision, she found herself not just listening, but already solving the problems he hadn't seen yet. "You're going to run out of runway here," she told him quietly, pointing to a gap in his projections. You need bridge financing before your first product cycle completes. Richard stared at her. Then he smiled. How do you know that? Because I've watched 20 companies make the same mistake, she said simply. I know what it looks like from the outside. That was the night Eleanor Brooks, still Eleanor Whitfield then, became the invisible engine behind what would eventually become Brooks Technologies. When they married a year later, Eleanor made a decision that most people around her couldn't fully understand. She stepped back from her Wall Street career, quietly, without drama. She told herself it was temporary, just until Richard's company found its footing. She would write the business plans. She would balance the books. She would hunt for investors at networking events where Richard smiled and talked, and she stood beside him, handing him the right numbers when he needed them and never, ever taking credit. She mortgaged the small inheritance her grandmother had left her to keep the company solvent through its first rough winter. She gave up a promotion offer from a firm in Chicago that would have changed her life. She worked through 2 pregnancies, managing accounts from a hospital bed with a laptop balanced on her knees. She did all of this not because she had no choice, but because she genuinely believed in Richard, and because, in those early years, he believed in her too. Those were the years of cheap takeout containers on the kitchen counter at midnight, of spreadsheets taped to the garage walls, of arguments that weren't really arguments but strategy sessions, of falling asleep over coffee and waking up with new ideas. Those were the years they were a team. But success is a strange thing. It tends to rewrite the story of how it happened. And as Brooks Technologies grew, first slowly, then explosively, Richard began to forget the garage. He began to forget the folding table and the borrowed confidence and the woman who had quietly, methodically solved every problem before he knew it existed. New people entered their world. Wealthy people, glamorous people, people who talked about legacy and brand and image. Richard started spending more time at private clubs and exclusive galas. He bought suits that cost more than their first year of rent. He gave interviews in which he talked about his instincts, his vision, his relentless drive. Eleanor's name never appeared. Not once. And Eleanor? She remained in the background. Not because she was pushed there, not yet, but because she had grown so accustomed to it. She managed the household. She attended charity events and smiled beside her husband. And quietly, without anyone watching, she continued doing something else entirely. She had never stopped investing, not once. From the very beginning, Eleanor had been managing a separate portfolio. Modest at first, almost invisible, routed through legal structures she had quietly established using knowledge from her Wall Street years. Money she had set aside carefully, compound interest working in the shadows, reinvested in sectors she understood better than almost anyone. Technology, healthcare, renewable energy, real estate. Not recklessly, methodically, patiently. The way Eleanor did everything. Richard knew nothing about it, and that was not an accident. The announcement came on a Tuesday. Richard called a company-wide meeting at Brooks Technologies headquarters and walked into the room with the kind of energy that only comes from something enormous. The company had secured a $50 million international partnership, a deal that would expand their reach into 3 new continents. The room erupted. People were hugging. Someone opened a bottle of champagne before the meeting even officially ended. That evening, there was a celebration dinner at one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants. Richard was in full performance mode, making toasts, slapping backs, basking in the warmth of everyone's admiration. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table in a midnight blue dress, watching him the way she always had, quietly, with a kind of love that had slowly, over the years, started to look a lot like grief. Then Richard clinked his glass and stood. "I want to say something," he announced. The table went quiet. This deal didn't happen overnight. It took years of work, sacrifice, and sheer force of will. He paused for effect. And I did it. Laughter, appreciative murmurs. He turned slightly toward Eleanor, and for a brief moment she actually thought, he was going to acknowledge her. 23 years, the garage, the nights, the sacrifices. Maybe, finally. Instead, he smiled his famous smile and said, "My wife hasn't worked a day in 20 years. She's been living very comfortably because of me." More laughter, some of it awkward. Someone coughed. A woman across the table caught Eleanor's eye and immediately looked away. Eleanor said nothing. She picked up her wine glass and took a slow, steady sip. But something behind her eyes shifted. Something very quiet. Very final. 3 days later, Richard came home in a fury. He had spent the afternoon with Marcus Hale, a young executive who had recently become his most trusted advisor, and whose primary talent, it turned out, was telling Richard exactly what he wanted to hear. Marcus had apparently decided that Eleanor was a liability, that she projected an image of the past, that a man of Richard's stature needed to be seen moving forward, not backward. Richard didn't even sit down when he walked in. He stood in the middle of the living room, still in his coat. "I want a divorce," he said. Eleanor looked up from the book she was reading. "Excuse me?" "I'm done, Eleanor. I've spoken to my lawyers. You'll be taken care of financially, but I need you to leave." She set the book down very slowly. "Richard, what are you—" "You were useful once," he said. His voice was flat, almost clinical, like he was discussing a business decision. "You were useful once, and now you're not. That's all this is." She stared at him for a long moment. 23 years sat in the air between them, heavy and invisible. Then she stood. She walked to the bedroom, and when she came back 40 minutes later, she was carrying a single suitcase. Richard was surprised. He had expected pleading. He had expected tears, negotiation, the whole theater of it. Instead, she walked past him toward the front door, paused briefly at the antique side table near the entrance, and slipped something into her coat pocket. A small leather notebook, weathered at the corners and secured with a thin leather strap. Then she walked out. Richard watched her go, already reaching for his phone. He didn't give it another thought. That night, Eleanor sat alone in a roadside motel room 2 towns over. The carpet was old. The heating made a clicking sound. She set the suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and opened the leather notebook. Inside were account numbers, holding company details, trust documents, a sealed letter from her grandfather's estate lawyers, and at the very front, in her own handwriting from more than 2 decades ago, a single line, "For when it is time." Eleanor closed the notebook. She looked at the water-stained ceiling for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and began to dial. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comment section. This story is just getting started. The calls she made that night and throughout the next 2 days were not dramatic. Eleanor was not a dramatic person. She was precise. She was methodical. She called her estate attorney first, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had been managing Eleanor's private affairs for 11 years, and who, when she heard Eleanor's voice, simply said, "Is it time?" And Eleanor said, "Yes." She called the managing partner of the family trust her grandfather had established. She called a senior director at one of the holding companies she quietly controlled. She called an old colleague from her Wall Street days who now ran a boutique firm specializing in strategic acquisitions. Each call was short. Each call had been, in some sense, anticipated. The pieces had always been in place. They had simply been waiting for Eleanor to move them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard was not thinking about Eleanor at all. He was celebrating, planning the press rollout for the $50 million deal, scheduling meetings with the international partners, ordering new furniture for his redesigned corner office. He was so consumed by his own momentum that when his assistant flagged a series of unusual communications from the holding company that managed Brooks Technologies' foundational intellectual property portfolio, he waved her off without reading them. He would regret that. By the 3rd day after Eleanor left, things began to go wrong in small ways. that no one could immediately trace. A document that should have been countersigned was missing. A partner on the international deal sent a short, formal email requesting confirmation of certain ownership structures before proceeding. Richard's legal team started digging, and the deeper they dug, the quieter the room became. It started with the patents. Brooks Technologies had been built on a foundation of intellectual property, a series of foundational patents that formed the backbone of its most profitable products. Richard had always assumed these were cleanly under the company's ownership. His name was everywhere in the public story of the company, but the actual legal architecture, the fine-grained ownership structures, the licensing agreements, the holding arrangements, those had been put together in the early years by Eleanor. And Eleanor, with her Wall Street precision and her quiet foresight, had structured everything through a series of family trusts and private holding companies. All perfectly legal, all meticulously documented, all completely invisible unless you knew where to look. The majority stake in the holding company that controlled the foundational patents did not belong to Richard Brooks. Richard's senior attorney called him on a Thursday afternoon, and the tone of his voice when Richard picked up was something Richard had never heard from him before. A kind of careful, deliberate calm that people use when they are delivering information that they know is going to cause an explosion. "Richard," the attorney said, "we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Richard was looking out his office window, barely paying attention. "The kind where the $50 million deal cannot proceed without approval from a majority stakeholder who is not you." A pause. "What are you talking about?" "The foundational IP portfolio, the ownership structure." "Richard, you need to come in. Today." Richard canceled 3 meetings. He drove to the law offices at twice the legal speed limit, and there, spread across a conference table in alarming detail, was the architecture of something he had never understood. An empire that had been built quietly alongside his own, in the margins and shadows of everything he had taken credit for. "Who is this?" he said, pointing at the name of the majority stakeholder across the trust documents. His attorney looked at him steadily. "You know who that is, Richard." The truth came in layers, each one more staggering than the last. 23 years earlier, when Richard had been turned down by every bank and traditional investor he approached, it was Eleanor who had kept the company alive, not with small contributions, with a substantial inheritance she had received from her maternal grandfather, a man named Charles Whitfield, who had spent his life quietly building wealth in ways almost nobody in the family had understood until he was gone. The inheritance had come with conditions, strict confidentiality requirements, established through the estate's legal structure, which meant Eleanor could not simply announce what she was doing. She had accepted those conditions and invested through anonymous channels, as the structures required. But she had done something else too, something that Richard, even now, couldn't quite absorb. Over the course of 23 years, Eleanor had never stopped working. While the world saw a devoted wife who had stepped back from her career, what Eleanor had actually done was redirect it. Every investment she made was deliberate, patient, and calibrated. She had reinvested profits from the holding company back into emerging sectors, technology companies in their early stages, healthcare firms developing breakthrough treatments, renewable energy projects that most investors considered too risky or too slow. She had operated through carefully managed structures, maintaining the confidentiality her grandfather's estate required, growing her holdings incrementally and invisibly. And then, the world had caught up with her vision. The technology bets paid off spectacularly. The healthcare investments surged. The renewable energy portfolio became one of the highest performing in its class. What had started as a protected inheritance quietly deployed to save a struggling startup had grown, compounded, and expanded over 2 decades into something that defied easy description. Eleanor Brooks had become one of the wealthiest private individuals in America. Forbes had been tracking unusual financial movements for some time. Their investigative team had been piecing together the picture for months, following holding company trails, cross-referencing trust documents that had become visible through other filings, speaking to industry contacts who had quietly worked with or alongside Eleanor over the years. The story was not a rumor. It was a documented, verified, comprehensive profile. And the day it published, the day the Forbes Global Billionaires Special Edition hit every digital platform and the presses of every business publication that had licensed the content, was the fourth day after Richard had thrown his wife out with a single suitcase and called her dead weight. Richard found out the way everyone else did. His phone started ringing at 6:14 in the morning before he was fully awake. His assistant, then his PR head, then 2 board members, then a journalist. He picked up the last call. "Mr. Brooks," the journalist said carefully, "we're running a story on your wife, your estranged wife, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to comment before publication." "A story about what?" Richard's voice was rough with sleep. A brief, almost gentle pause. "About her debut on the Forbes Global Billionaires list, sir. She's ranking quite high." Richard turned on the television, then his laptop. Then he walked to the window with his phone in his hand and just stood there, reading the same name over and over again, watching the same face appear on screen after screen after screen. Eleanor Brooks, the secret billionaire, the hidden architect, the woman behind the empire. And then the attorney's call came. The $50 million deal was frozen. The international partners had reviewed the ownership structures and were not prepared to proceed without majority stakeholder approval from the relevant holding company. Without Eleanor's signature, the deal did not exist. Richard sat in his empty office for a long time. The champagne stains from the celebration dinner still hadn't been fully cleaned from the carpet. He found her through Patricia Vance, Eleanor's attorney, who was not particularly warm on the phone but was professionally efficient. A meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. A small, quiet restaurant in Midtown that Eleanor had chosen. Neutral ground. No cameras. Richard arrived first. He had not slept properly in 2 days. He sat with a glass of water and watched the door, and when Eleanor walked in, he was struck, genuinely struck, by how composed she was. She was wearing a simple gray coat. Her posture was the same as it had always been. She looked like herself, entirely and completely herself, in a way that made Richard feel, for the first time in a long time, genuinely small. She sat across from him. She ordered tea. She waited. "Eleanor," he began. His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "I don't even know where to start." "Then start with the truth," she said quietly. He put both hands flat on the table. "I made a catastrophic mistake. Multiple mistakes. I don't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I stopped seeing you. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I stopped seeing you. And then I listened to people who didn't know you, didn't know us, and I made a decision that I—" His voice broke. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I am profoundly sorry." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in her face. There was something quieter than anger, and somehow harder to sit with. "I didn't hide my life from you to punish you, Richard," she said. "I respected your confidentiality requirements. I honored the terms of what I inherited. But I also—" She paused. "I think I believed that if I were ever truly needed, you would see me. I believed that even without knowing the details, you would simply know who I was. Because I was there, every day, in every decision that mattered." Richard looked down at the table. "I never needed your money," she continued. Her voice was even and clear. "I never needed your status. I never needed the mansion or the events or the invitations. I needed your respect. I spent 23 years building something alongside you, and I needed you. To see it, not because I wanted recognition, but because without it, I was invisible inside my own life." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "The deal," he started. Eleanor lifted one hand slightly. "I'm not here about the deal, Richard. My attorneys will communicate with your attorneys. That's a business matter." "Then why are you here?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Because 23 years ago, you were a man I believed in completely. And I wanted to sit across from you one more time and remind you of that. So that whatever comes next, for both of us, you know it's true. She left the restaurant calmly, pausing only to leave a generous tip for the server. Richard sat alone at the table for a long time after she was gone. Eleanor did not return to the mansion. She did not pursue any dramatic legal battle. She communicated only through counsel, settled everything efficiently, and moved forward. What she did next was the part that completed the story. She established a foundation, the Whitfield Brooks Foundation, named for both sides of her heritage, specifically dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs over the age of 40. Women who had spent years building things for others and were now ready to build for themselves. Women who had been invisible inside their own expertise. The foundation offered funding, mentorship, legal support, and a network of connections that Eleanor had spent 2 decades quietly accumulating. Within 18 months, the foundation had supported over 3,000 women across the country. It had helped launch enterprises in technology, healthcare, agriculture, and finance. Several of those enterprises had gone on to attract significant outside investment. The foundation became the subject of case studies in MBA programs. Eleanor was invited to speak at conferences where, a year earlier, she would have been introduced as somebody's wife. She spoke simply and without performance. She told her story plainly, and every time she finished, the room was quiet in the way that rooms only go quiet when something true has been said. In one of her most widely shared talks, she said this: "I never resented the years I spent in the background. I learned something in those years that I could not have learned any other way. I learned what it means to build without applause, and I want you to hear this clearly. Building without applause is not a lesser kind of building. It is often a more honest one." Richard rebuilt his company eventually, modestly, with more humility than he had ever operated with before. He gave a single interview in which he said only that he had made mistakes and that the greatest professional regret of his life was not recognizing Eleanor's contributions while he still could. He did not reach out to Eleanor again. Some people who knew them said that was probably the most respectful thing he had done in years. As for Eleanor, she was not defined by any of it. Not by the marriage, not by the betrayal, not even by the Forbes headline, which she found mildly amusing and enormously overstated. She was defined by the same thing she had always been defined by: what she built carefully and patiently over a very long time. A journalist once asked her if she had ever wanted Richard to know, during all those years, what she was quietly doing. She thought about it for a moment. Then she smiled and said, "What I wanted was for him to know who I was. The two things are not the same. Sometimes the people standing quietly beside us are carrying kingdoms we cannot see. They are the ones who write the plans before there is anything to plan for, who hold the structure together while everyone else takes the bows, who build in silence not because they have no voice, but because they have chosen to invest their energy in building rather than performing. And the terrible, beautiful truth is that the world only tends to notice them when they finally, quietly, walk away." Eleanor Brooks walked away, and the world noticed. But the kingdom had been hers all along. What would you have done in Eleanor's place? When you have spent decades building alongside someone, loving them, sacrificing for them, believing in them, and they discard you like something no longer useful, what does the dignified response look like? Eleanor's answer was not revenge. Her answer was not bitterness. Her answer was to keep building, to continue becoming, to walk out of one chapter and begin a new one with the same steady, quiet, extraordinary intention she had brought to everything she had ever touched. The final quote on her foundation's website reads, "Never underestimate the person who helped you climb. One day, you may discover they were the mountain all along." And that's a wrap on Eleanor's story. Now we want to hear yours. Should Eleanor have forgiven Richard, or was walking away the right choice? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If you haven't already, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. We have more incredible stories of sacrifice, strength, and extraordinary second chances coming your way. We'll see you in the next one.